welcome. I'm the president of the Harvard Business School Club of Toronto. It is exciting for us to see you join us for the session on elevated economics with Richard Steele. I want to run through a couple of logistics items first, and then introduce my co-moderator, Stephen Elrickman, and our speaker today, Richard Steele. First off, this session is being recorded. Please note that for any questions you may ask, and if you ask questions in the chat, we'll do our best to ask this question of Richard, and we will do our best to name the person who asked the question. The logistics of the call further are that Richard will share some of his slides and some of the insights and research that he's prepared in putting together elevated economics. Steve and I will ask Richard some questions, and then we'll also take audience questions thereafter. We're excited to have this session, and what I'd like to do now is introduce Stephen Elrickman, who is an MBA grad of HBS. He's the member of the board of directors of the HBS Club of Toronto and a past president of the club. He is a Toronto-based partner of Fasken, an international law firm, and advises on ESG matters. Steve was the executive director of the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance and has been referred to as a leading governance expert, as a leading practitioner in the Canadian fund industry, and one of Canada's top M&A attorneys. In 2016, Global Proxy Watch named Steve one of the 10 people around the world who have had the most impact on corporate governance. I'm excited that Steve is able to join us. Thank you, Steve, to speak together with Richard Steele. Steve and I will have a conversation with Richard, and like I mentioned earlier, facilitate your questions. And then now for introduction of our speaker, Richard. Richard is the CEO of Parsec Ventures, a very active member of multiple boards, and a chair of a philanthropic fund. He is one of Inc. magazine's fastest growing company CEOs, has run both private and public companies. He advised the White House Business Council, as well as the Biden for President campaign on economic policy. And he is an HBS alumnus and serves on the HBS Alumni Board. Richard is the author of Elevated Economics, and we will discuss its topic, the topic of the book, together with Richard's views on the current role and importance of purpose and personal values for investors, consumers, and business owners. Everybody, please welcome Richard, and I would like to hand over the discussion to him. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Boris. I very much appreciate it. It's wonderful to be with you. Stephen, thank you so much for spending your time with us as well. And thanks to everybody for joining. We've got a good session. Hopefully we'll get through some really interesting information and hopefully some new information for you as well. So I'm going to share my screen and take you through some slides quickly. And then after that, we'll get to the discussion. So thank you again to Boris and to Stephen. It's such a pleasure to be with everybody today. You know, you've heard a little bit about my background. Just to give a little bit further information, the work and the research has been featured by the companies and the media outlets that you see below. I've been researching the book for about 2 years prior to writing it, and then wrote it you know, pre-COVID and COVID. So we'll talk about some of the changes that we've seen recently. I would say that, you know, the book's been fairly well received by, I think, some folks that would have a hand in shaping this new economy, this elevated economy that I talk about, and some of what those folks have had to say you see here. But you know, let's get to it. Let's get to it. I think that when you look at some of the changes that have happened recently, they're very interesting and they're very profound. I spend a lot of time talking with business leaders and folks in government about how business and society are changing and sort of what leadership looks like in the future. And recently, things have been accelerating at a very, very fast pace. So I decided to delve into the events that were shaping those changes. And as an anecdote, this past summer, I was rafting on the Colorado River, and it was a place where the Colorado River and the Roaring Fork River meet. And that point at which two rivers meet is called a confluence. But it's only called a confluence if rivers of similar size meet. And similarly, I think in society are at a point where we've got a confluence of events and changes happening that are of similar size or of similar importance. And these changes have been happening over the last little while with, a backdrop of a leadership vacuum, I think, at the highest levels, both in our country here in the United States and around the world. And people's concerns aren't getting addressed by government. And when the public sector fails, the responsibility of leadership falls to the private sector. So change is being driven like never before. And consumers now expect folks in leadership and corporate governance to sort of take up that mantle. So what are some of these events, these confluence of events? Climate change, obviously, racial injustice, as we saw specifically come to a boiling point this past summer, diversity and inclusion issues and regulation and new accounting standards that incorporate some of these things into their frameworks as well. And then the investing and consumption habits of the next generation, which are totally different than generations previously, and the accessibility and ubiquity of information. So as I was researching the book, I came across a headline in the New York Times that said, shareholder value is no longer everything, top CEOs say. Right? So that was the headline on 8/19/19. And I thought, well, this is an odd headline. What about Milton Friedman? And what about his theory of shareholder primacy? And sort of, who are all these, left-wing nut job CEOs saying that the profit isn't everything? Well, here they are. Turns out it's Jeff Bezos and Mary Barra of General Motors, Larry Fink of BlackRock, and Julie Sweet from Accenture, and Brian Moynihan from Bank of America, and Tim Cook of Apple, and Robert Smith of Vista Equity Partners, and the list goes on and on and on. There are 133 CEOs from America's largest companies that agree with the statement that shareholder value is no longer the top priority of business. And among those CEOs, there are 133 others other than the 7 that I just mentioned, so 140 total. And among them are Doug McMillon, who's the CEO of Walmart, and he's the chairman of the Business Roundtable. And Jamie Dimon and Beth Ford are also members of the Business Roundtable, as are the CEOs of Johnson & Johnson and Accenture and the Boston Consulting Group, and the list goes on. Well, so who is this Business Roundtable? This is this group of 140 CEOs of America's biggest companies. And here's what they said on 8/19/19 was the new purpose of business, the new purpose of a corporation. 5 bullet points. First, delivering value to customers, okay? Second, investing in employees, including training and education and diversity, inclusion, dignity, and respect. It was listed. That's number 2. Number 3, dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers. It's the third purpose of business. Number 4, supporting the communities in which we work. And then dead last on the list of 5, generating value for shareholders, generating long-term value for shareholders. So the last bullet point is getting return for shareholders. So that's really interesting. So that brings us to this concept of ESG. So environmental, social, and governance. So ESG investing, this is this growing category of investment choices that blend these 3 elements together: environmental, social, and governance. So when we think about ESG, we think about the environment, we think about air emissions and air quality and energy use and the things you see listed here. On the social side, what do our relationships with employees look like, and suppliers, and the communities in which we operate? What is our impact to the local community? What are our labor standards and employee relations? What does that look like? And governance, Stephen could talk about governance all day long. Governance, right? It's how a company behaves and their standards for their leadership and their risk controls, their transparency, voting rights, and all that sort of stuff. So taken together, these 3 things, E, S, and G, are seeing, more than a renaissance. I think they're really seeing a sea change in the way the companies operate. So here's some recent headlines, right? Move over, Fang. The next decade of investing will be defined by ESG. That's from Morgan Stanley. Larry Fink says investors are shifting to ESG-focused firms. Sustainable fund assets hit 1.2 trillion in 2020. And sustainable investing and ESG investing is something that everybody should be considering. This is from BNP Paribas. So those are some headlines. Here's a few from our friends at HBS. All right. I had to conclude this, of course, for this group. When you see the various headlines that talk about these changes, these are real world changes, right? You'll see, Harvard's endowment went greenhouse gas neutral. You saw during a collapse, George Serafim, who's done some really great work, really interesting work about impact-weighted accounting and things like that, impact-weighted accounts at HBS. He has shown from his research that during a market collapse, investors will pay more for companies that they consider to be resilient or sustainable. Another real world impact, right? Unilever spending €1 billion getting fossil fuels out of its detergents, right? And it's that's a lot of money. It's real money. Social bonds, right? Surging as conscious investing turns mainstream. So a social bond is a contract with the public sector or a governing authority whereby it pays for better social outcomes in certain areas and passes on the part of the savings achieved to the investors. But they're for investors that are interested in not just a financial return on their investment, but also in social impact. So here's just some headlines and some real world impacts as well. Now, the big one, right? If you're thinking, okay, well, ESG and these companies are making some changes, and who is it, and are any of the big players making these changes? We'll look at Walmart, right? Biggest of the big companies. Not only did they pledge in September of last year to go greenhouse gas neutral, but they announced their goal to become a regenerative company. So really taking ownership of the environment. So they had pledged to restore forests and ocean as well. So replenishing in addition to conserving. Then you've got some of the financial institutions and the banks and pension funds setting new climate targets and also reporting their climate impact. You've got big pension funds dropping fossil fuel stocks, right? So the demand is reduced. And then if you take that a step further, you'll see that there are banks pledging net zero financed emissions. So what that means is that they won't lend to projects that impact greenhouse gas emissions. So think about drilling in the Arctic or mining or coal exploration, et cetera. And so if you think about what the natural outcome is there, the cost of capital, of course, goes way up for those companies that need funding to do that sort of exploration. And so if they're not able to get it from a growing number of banks, their cost of capital goes up and those projects become less attractive. So Boris, I'm going to ask you to put up question number 1 on the screen for our audience here. So some of this stems from banks wanting to align themselves with the SDG. So I'm asking the audience here, have you heard of the term SDGs? So we say that we're talking Sierra Delta Golf, SDG. So who knows what that acronym stands for? So take a moment, just say yes or no, and we'll move on and talk about the SDGs here for a second. So Boris, you can feel free to tally up the results. Go ahead.
Yes. I think we still need more people to push the buttons.
Okay. All right.
Yes or no, folks?
No worries. So again, we're talking about some of the banks wanting to align themselves with the SDGs and that being some of the motivation, of course not all, but some of the motivation for looking at pledging to have net zero financed emissions. So we just wanted to get a handle on, if folks have heard of that term SDGs.
So Richard, it's not fair. Boris and I can't vote.
I know it says that. It says on my screen as well. Hosts and panelists can't vote. We'd be skewing the tables.
The answer is yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
Thank you. All right, so we'll give everybody just a couple more seconds here before Boris closes it up for us. So of those folks that have taken the time to push the button, we'll have our results here in just a sec. And then we can talk about the SDGs.
Here they are, Richard.
All right, so about 69% no, 31% yeah. Okay, so interesting mix. So let's talk about the SDGs. And thank you, Boris. You can close that poll. We appreciate it. So let's talk about the SDGs. So the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals. Hold on just one second here. And Boris, unfortunately, my sometimes after the poll, there we go, phrases up a little bit. So the SDGs, so let's talk about the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. And the SDGs, they provide a shared blueprint for what the UN calls peace and prosperity for people and the planet now and into the future. So basically at its heart, there are 17 goals. You see them all here. They're color-coded and numbered. And it is an urgent call for action by all countries, right? They recognize that ending poverty and other deprivations has to go hand in hand with strategies that improve the health and education and reduce inequality and spur economic growth, all while taking into account climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. So the SDGs, they combine to make up this framework that's used for businesses and governments all over the world to map to the outcomes that society is demanding of them. So they're again, number and color coded as you see here. So these are the SDGs. So let's look at a little bit more on E, S, and G. We've talked a lot about E, environment, but as we get into the S, social, it's really interesting, right? You see that market demand has been reshaping behavior at the highest levels. The speed of that change is very, very, very quick, very rapid. And in the US, Citigroup did this study and found that Black workers have lost $113 billion in potential wages over the past 2 decades because they couldn't get a college degree. The housing market lost $218 billion in the US in sales because Black applicants couldn't get home loans. And about $13 trillion in business revenue never flowed into the economy because Black entrepreneurs couldn't access bank loans. And what's more, the Citigroup study found that the US could have $5 trillion in gross domestic product, $5 trillion in GDP over the next 5 years if those gaps were closed today. And then you see some of the headlines here as well. So when we think about the S and E, S and G, these are real and important issues. So let's look at some other factors in S. As far as gender parity goes, female CEOs only make up 7.4% of the Fortune 500. And in the 2020 rankings, only 8 companies of the top 100 were run by women. Now, government is beginning, and companies as well, are beginning to address this, right? So in California, you've got Senate Bill 826 that said that if you're a public company and you're domiciled in the state of California, you have to have at least 1 female board member. And by next year, by 2022, that's going to be 2 female board members. NASDAQ proposes the same thing. They said that they want more diversity on all the 3,000 companies that are listed on the NASDAQ. And they want at least 1 woman and 1 person who identifies as underrepresented or LGBTQ on the board. So there are strides being made. We've got a long ways to go. I would say as well that it's not just companies, right, but governments who are taking action as well. And you've got 823 cities, 101 regions that have net zero targets. You've got 1,541 companies that are pledging net zero targets in 2020. And just to give you some context, in 2019, that number was 500. So 500 companies in 2019 said, that had pledged that they're going to be carbon neutral by a certain date. And then last year, 2020, 1,500 companies have said the same thing. A lot of them did that during Climate Week, which is a week-long conference in New York. In 2020, again, 1,500 companies have pledged zero emissions. But China was the big sort of thunderous announcement at Climate Week in 2020. In September, bound to go carbon neutral by 2060. Now, again, these are voluntary statements. The folks that make these announcements, they also set their own end date. So China gave themselves a good healthy 40 years to get carbon neutral. But it is a step in the right direction, and it was quite an astounding announcement. And for the first time in the United States, the Fed said that climate poses a stability risk. So you having the Federal Reserve acknowledge the obvious, quite frankly, but acknowledge that climate poses stability risks. That's big. And then in California, the governor there, Governor Newsom, ordered that no internal combustion cars will be sold in the state of California by 2035. So over the next 14 years now, we'll have a phase out of gas-powered vehicles. And just one other note too, in the city of San Francisco, they're saying, hey, for any new construction, we're not going to have any more natural gas. So everything's going to be electric for heating and cooking as well. So I think that we're seeing the shift. Here's all the data. We've seen the numbers so far, but I think that if all those headlines aren't enough, you know that ESG has arrived when the accountants get involved, right? When all the accountants get together and they agree on something, you really know it's gaining some steam and some traction. So when the big four accounting firms endorse official ESG reporting standards, that's a real moment. So Deloitte and Ernst & Young and KPMG and PricewaterhouseCoopers. So that's a big deal. Also the World Economic Forum had released some new ESG reporting metrics as well. All right, so let's move on here, if we may, pardon me. Boris, if you could put up question number 2 on the screen here. We're going to ask the audience over the next 5 years, what % of professionally managed assets in the United States? I know we have a Canadian audience. I'm sorry to be so U.S. centric, but in the United States, what are the what's the percentage of professionally managed assets in the U.S. that are projected to have an ESG mandate? So those investments that will be directed by the owners of those assets to have an ESG mandate. So our answers here: 10%, maybe 25%, maybe 50%. So let's tally up those answers when we have a moment here. And as a backdrop to that, sustainable investing assets reached $17 trillion in 2020, as you can see by the US SIF report that's on your screen. So Boris, let's see the answers here. Okay, so 11% you say 10%, 25% of you say 47, sorry, 47% say 25%, and then 42% of the respondents say 50%. Okay, interesting, really interesting. Good broad spectrum. So Boris, if you can close the poll. We'll have to wait a minute for to get an adjustment. Here we go. So actually, it's half. The answer is half. Half of all professionally managed assets in the U.S. will have an ESG mandate by 2025. So that's a short window, right? Another 4 years from now, we'll be looking at half of all professionally managed assets, which is just massive. It's just a huge change. All right. So what about all these people that say, look, I don't want to trade financial returns, right, for all this nonsense. What about investing? So Boris, I'm actually going to ask you to put up question 3. I know we're back to back on questions for the audience here, but if you can put up question number 3, let's talk about financial return and trade-off. So would you agree with this statement? In order to invest sustainably, I'd be sacrificing some financial return. So in order to invest sustainably, I'd be sacrificing some financial return. So yes, no, or not sure. What do we think about this? Do we think that you have to sacrifice a little bit, maybe a lot of financial return, maybe none? Who knows? So we'll give you just a couple of seconds to finish clicking the little radio button there next to your choice, and then Boris will be able to tally them up.
By the way, I just wanted to make a quick comment that more people are responding faster to this question, Richard, than the previous two. There's some excitement about this question.
That's great. No, thank you everybody for participating. I appreciate it. And we'll be done with the slides here in a little bit, and then we'll get into a robust Q&A. All right, so giving up some return. Wow, 40% yes, 40% no, 20% not sure. I love it. All right, Boris, let's move on. We'll close out that and we'll go to the next slide. And the good news is here that you don't have to trade financial return for investing in ESG assets. So just give me a moment here, Boris. Here we go. So says Morgan Stanley, so says Barron's, and so says Morningstar. So it's really interesting. Research conducted on the performance of 11,000 mutual funds from 2004 to 2018 shows that there's no financial trade-off in the returns of sustainable funds compared to traditional funds. And they demonstrate lower downside risk. Now, look, I know you all can read, but I'm just going to read that alongside you because it's just such a compelling statistic. Also, Barron's, right there, they looked at their top 100 most sustainable companies. They outperformed the S&P, those top 100 sustainable companies last year. Very, very interesting. Morningstar also found the same thing. So sustainable funds and indexes perform on par with conventional funds. And a focus on company level ESG factors rather than exclusionary screening. We'll talk about negative screening as we get to the end here. It can lead to better risk adjusted performance at the portfolio level. There are some funds that, and I'm not kidding here, Stephen can back me up on this, as can Boris, there are some funds that only use ESG criteria as their investment criteria. They are not looking at, for public companies, they're not looking at financial performance. They're looking at future performance based solely on ESG metrics. Really, really interesting stuff. All right, so as we see here, a strong ESG proposition actually links to value creation in 5 ways. So I'm not going to read through the whole slide here, but you can see top line growth and attracting customers and employees. Cost reductions, that's sort of an obvious thing, right? If you're using green energy and you're reducing your consumption and your water intake and things like that. Regulatory and legal interventions, productivity uplift, and investment and asset optimization. So a strong ESG proposition does link to value creation. So let us have a look at what I think is one of the most interesting things coming down the pike here. So the great wealth migration, the great wealth transfer, as it's sometimes called. $68 trillion, trillion with a T, is going to change hands over the next 2 decades. So the great wealth migration, this is a term that's used for this massive, massive amount of wealth that will be transferred between baby boomers to the next generations over the next 20, 25 years. So according to this report from Surley and Associates, 45 million US households will pass a mind-boggling $68 trillion to their children. The biggest generational wealth transfer ever. And guess what? All of those folks, 80% of them are looking for a new financial advisor. So that's going to be really interesting. And 75% are interested in sustainable investing. 86% of millennials interested in sustainable investing. 71% of those folks believe that companies with leading sustainability practices will be better long-term investments, no surprise there. And 80% are interested in sustainable investments that can be specifically customized to meet their goals. And so there are a lot of firms that are doing that now, where you can customize and pull various levers to customize your investments based on what's important to you. It's really, really interesting stuff. So Vikram Gandhi, probably a bunch of you know him from HBS. Really, really interesting statistics and research that he's been doing. He was very helpful to me in some research for the book and some other things, some interviews as well. 22% of boomers express interest in impact investing. For Gen X, that's 31%. Millennials, 71%. So the millennial generation, I know we hear a lot about them all the time. These are the ones who are going to be driving change. And of course, Gen Z is reported to take that percentage much, much higher. Okay, so the millennials are the ones that are willing to pay more for sustainable products. They're the ones that are checking the labeling and the packaging to ensure that there's a positive social and environmental impact. By the way, they're looking at your websites as well to make sure that you've got some messaging about the environment and how you operate across the ESG spectrum as well. And these are the ones who prefer to work for a sustainable company. More on that in a second. So let's look at this. Millennials, they are the future of sustainability in the United States. 83% of them say that they agree with this statement. It is extremely or very important for me that companies implement programs to improve the environment. Now, if you look at publicly traded companies, before 2013 and before, 20% of the S&P chose to disclose their ESG information, 20%. Now, 85%. So I'm not going to read you the whole slide, but you get it, right? Before 2013, 20%. Now it's 85% of the S&P 500 are disclosing their ESG status. And guess what? The media, beautiful free press, is tracking them and holding them accountable. So we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So the other thing is you see that it is easier than ever to identify companies that reflect your values and concerns. So as an investor, all this information is at your fingertips. So right alongside all these standard financial reporting metrics, if you look all the way to the right-hand side on the screen right here, you'll see a sustainability tab as well. So right alongside the sustainability, the financial metrics are the ESG scores and information. So you can see a company's environmental risk score, their social score, and their governance score right there on almost any of these financial platforms. And you can see the product areas in which they are operating, see what they're involved in, see what their competitors are doing in the space as well. Okay, a lot of information, a lot of data. This is the whole thing that I call the elevated economy, right? Elevated economics, hence the title of the book. Who wins? Who wins in the elevated economy? That's the question. Well, we all learned at HBS and other places about product, price, place, and promotion, but how much time did we spend talking about a missing crucial element, a missing fifth P in the four classic Ps of marketing? How much time did we spend talking about purpose? I argue not enough. And I would further say that companies who can legitimately articulate a story that includes meaning and purpose beyond simply product attributes, they will have a greater chance of winning in the new economy. And I think that a key piece of purpose can be summed up in ESG, right? They can be summed up in this three-letter acronym. So ESG, I think, is the door to driving purpose. Boris, if you can put up on the screen our last question for the group. We won't ask any more of our audience this morning, but or this afternoon, depending on where they may be. But if you could put up question number 4. I would like to ask all those folks who are working in a firm, leading a firm, would you consider your firm to be a purpose-driven company? So this is a simple question, yes, no, or not sure. Would you consider your firm to be a purpose-driven company? And I'm going to hold off on my commentary. Boris, you can tally up those results as soon as you're ready, as soon as everybody's clicked the mouse. But I want to wait to talk about some of the attributes of purpose. Go ahead, and Boris, if you can show the results. So, oh, wow. Would you consider your firm to be a purpose-driven company? 74% of us are saying yes, 10% saying no, and 17% saying not sure. Interesting, and thank you for that. Thank you for participating. Boris, yeah, you can take down that poll. So all the research shows that purpose motivates employees to join a firm, to stay there longer, to work harder, and to be more creative. Purpose drives decision-making for investors, whether to buy or sell. Purpose increases a consumer's willingness to pay for goods and services, as we've just seen before in those previous slides on millennials and their consumption and investing habits. So that's really interesting. And thank you, everybody, for participating in that last poll. So purpose can really drive a lot of what we do. I think that ESG is the gateway drug, if you will, to purpose. And let us, Boris, I'm just going to need an extra moment as we can, as my computer sort of comes back to life and lets me go to the next slide. Here we go. So, as one Nelson report put it, there's this new era of sustainability rising. I hope we've demonstrated that with all this research and all these headlines and all the stats and numbers that we've just gone over. Why do these shifts feel urgent? Because look, it's becoming a life and death matter for a lot of people. Look at Houston, Texas over the last few days, right? Look at the Amazon over the summer and into the present moment. Look at this, all the things that we've talked about before, the social injustice and all that stuff that we talked about at the top. The change is happening fast and the responses are dramatic. And I think that you'll see that purpose is inherently linked to issues of greater importance than any of those other 4 Ps. And buying for purpose means that people are beginning to make economic choices through macro lenses rather than micro considerations. What do I mean by that? I say in the book that you can never get somebody to act against their own self-interest. It's not going to happen. But what's happening is people are expanding the definition of what is in their self-interest. All of a sudden, the environment is in their self-interest. Their community is in their self-interest. Social justice issues aren't just important for other people, they're important for that consumer, that investor. So people are making investment decisions and purchase decisions based on a larger consideration set. And I think that that is exciting. It's a trend that's not going to change. We talked about a little bit about the benefits of running a sustainable and purpose-driven company, but sustainable companies are better at retention. We talked about that. Studies showed that employee turnover is 25 to 50% lower among sustainable firms. For non-executive employees, the cost of turnover is about 3 to 6 months salary. For executive level employees, it's about 12 to 24 months of salary. ESG, as we've talked about, it saves money in heating, cooling, electricity, wastewater management, resource consumption, a whole host of other areas as well. All right, so what are the consequences if companies don't change? That's an interesting, we talk about, what if companies do change? What if they don't change? Well, we saw Unilever spending €1 billion attempting to align its products with its customers' values. That's real money. Employee activism, right, is another. So the first category, right, is consumers shunning brands that don't align with their values, and the Unilever is just one small example of that. Employee activism being another consequence. So, if you remember, I think it was 2 summers ago, in response to climate inaction by their company, the Amazon Employees for Climate Justice was formed and then staged a walkout. Amazon later pledged $2 billion to the climate crisis. On the day of the walkout, you had folks from employees from Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Apple as well also walk off the job. You had Wayfair employees refuse to work. They didn't want the mattresses that they sold to be used in the kids in cages debacle at the southern border of the United States. And you had Google employees refusing to work for military projects as well. So employee activism has become a real driving factor as well. So what's next? Oops, pardon me, sorry. What's next? So Biden signed a whole bunch of executive orders, as we all know. They rejoined the Paris Agreement, tasked the federal government to electrify its fleet of vehicles, restored the EPA's mandate, and the list goes on and on. So I would say expect credits for electric vehicles, solar, wind, other green energy, expect those to continue. Expect the feds to follow California and Europe, right, with an increased green standards across all industries. The SEC announced that there's a gentleman named Satyam Khanna will serve as a senior policy advisor for climate and ESG. So this is a brand new role. So senior policy advisor for climate and ESG, which is a new role at the SEC. So Khanna is going to advise the SEC on environmental, social, and governance matters and advance related new initiatives across the divisions there as well. So some real big, meaningful changes. Elections have consequences, and here are some of them. All right, lastly, what can you do? I would encourage us all to think about this thought, this quote, that every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world that you want. So vote with your dollars, buy locally, buy from companies that align with your values, shun companies that don't align with your values. If somebody's a bad actor, don't support them. And it's really interesting because there's a bit of a dichotomy. A lot of us might volunteer or give money to charity. I run a charitable giving fund, and we might be giving money on one hand, but on the other hand, investing, maybe taking a passive strategy and investing in index funds, for example, that contribute to the causes that we're trying to support on the other hand, right? So we're creating the problem on the one side and then trying to fix it on the other side. So think about your investments. Put your money where your mouth is. Decide how those investments align with your values. You can choose who you bank with. If you think a little bit about, what your bank is doing, what sort of projects they're funding, and where do they stand on these issues, you can put your firm's money or your personal money in the right hands. And be a valued change agent in your organization. All this stuff that we talked about today and all this stuff in my book is about what's coming. And you know what's coming now. You can help your company position itself to win in the elevated economy. We showed examples of what happens to companies that don't adopt some of these changes, and some of the consequences that we think are coming, some of the consequences we've actually seen. And then what else? Speak up, right? Make your voice heard. Write a letter to the editor, talk to your congressperson, your elected representative. And listen, hey, I'm sorry, I know this was all very US centric. I was born in Nova Scotia. I spent my first, I think 13, 14 years in Halifax. My dad lives in Vancouver. So I still have my Canadian passport. I'm lucky to have that. Sometimes I felt like using it over the last few years. But I know this has been a little US centric, but I think that this speaks cross-border. So if the term isn't congressperson, your elected representative is somebody you can chat with, and support candidates and causes that align with your values. We talked about that a little bit. And hey, run for office. Why not? Go make a run for it. All right. Thank you so much for your attention. We can move into a Q&A. I really appreciate it. And Boris and Stephen, thank you for your time and your attention. I am happy to take questions. If anybody wants to reach out to me directly, here's all my contact information, so feel free. So I'll leave that up on the screen for a little bit, and then Boris, if you want to moderate or take some questions from the chat, I'm happy to take those.
Richard, thank you for this detailed and thoughtful presentation. What we will do now is Steve and I have some questions that we would like to ask of Richard. In the meanwhile, though, folks who are on the call, on the webinar, please do start sharing your questions in the chat, and then we will work them into our discussion. Steve, I know you had a couple of questions that you wanted to discuss with Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Boris. So Richard, first of all, thank you so much for that presentation. That's great. So Richard, you've talked about major multinational companies supporting purposeful business building and focusing more and more on ESG. But there is a belief among many ESG professionals, as well as institutional investors, that often companies are simply greenwashing. They're making strong commitments in order to appease stakeholders, including institutional investors and consumers, but they're just talking, they're not walking, and they don't have a true intent to follow through. So just, tell us your perspective on this, please.
Sure. Oh, that's an interesting and thoughtful question. So, first there was whitewashing, now there's greenwashing, and then I've also heard impact washing as well recently too. So a lot of washing going on, not all good. In fact, all bad in these instances. So greenwashing or impact washing, it is a real problem. And I think that there are a couple things that address it. First of all, to borrow a quote from Lincoln and then Martin Luther King, the arc of progress bends towards the just. So I think that over time, we will get to a place where society will demand and government will regulate and companies will respond in a way that is, if not genuine, then forced. But consumers aren't going to stand for bad behavior. And neither are governments. Consumers first. Governments are always the laggards, but they won't either. So there'll be some regulation there. I think that most notably and importantly and immediately, the free press is really our friend here with these issues. For example, Bloomberg has an accountability index that takes all of the companies that have made these pledges, and they have this very simple, easy to understand, color-coded framework that shows if a company is on track with their stated goals, aligned well with their stated goals, or has fallen behind in their stated goals. So that's just one small example. So I think the free press will hold these folks accountable. And there is a ubiquity of information, as we talked about before. There's really no place to hide. And there are some very, very interesting impact measurement tools that are coming online. So I help a company called POI that has an impact measurement tool, and that's all. It is objective information. It puts data at the heart of impact measurement. So impact measurement is its own industry, but typically it's been more subjective, right? It's been consultants, people with clipboards, surveys, self-reported data, which, as we all know, can be fraught with errors. this company that I've been advising in the impact measurement space, they take data and put that at the center. So it's objective, not subjective. And I think that with impact measurement tools, the free press, regulation, accountability from all of us, consumers and investors, I do think that plus the ubiquity of information, sort of no place to hide, will combat this over time. But there will be stories, of course, of folks that are impact washing or greenwashing. But thanks for the question.
So thank you. Let me ask another question. I see there are questions coming in through the chat, so that's great. But let me ask one other question. So you've talked about the concepts of ESG and SRI in this talk and in your book, and also in your book that you talk about the concept of return on value. And I'm wondering if you could please explain to our audience the difference you see between ESG and SRI. Also, you can explain what you mean by return on value or ROV, and also, talk about some of the other tools and metrics that you just mentioned before that are used to evaluate the impact of SRI.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try and answer those in order. And Steve, I appreciate the question, but it seems it's funny to me, right, to be explaining some of the governance stuff to probably our most preeminent governance expert we could possibly have on this call. So thank you, Steve, for asking the question, and I'm sure you might be able to answer it better than I. So ESG. ESG looks at the company's ESG, right, environmental, social, and governance practices, alongside more traditional financial measures. So that's ESG. Socially responsible investing, or SRI, I know there's lots of acronyms, right? ESG, SRI. So socially responsible investing, SRI, involves actively removing or choosing investments based on specific ethical guidelines. So they do things like negative screening. So it might be very important for you to not invest in companies that have any exposure to palm oil production. Or guns, tobacco, et cetera, and all these sin categories. And you can do a negative screen. There are companies like Aperio, who just got bought by BlackRock, that will look at your portfolio, and they'll do an audit and say, here's all the investments you have today. You probably didn't know this, but you're supporting gun manufacturers, or oil companies, or extraction firms, or all these other potentially negative things, and then they can construct a portfolio with you that is tax efficient, because that's always a concern, that will address those issues, right? So to sell those securities and buy others. So that's sort of like the negative screen approach, and that can be the socially responsible investing side. And then impact investing, sort of the third thing. So ESG, SRI, so environmental, social, and governance, ESG, socially responsible investing, SRI, and then impact investing looks to help a business or an organization, I guess, complete a project or develop a program to do something positive to benefit society. So you see like impact bonds, and an impact bond might be a bond that's put up by a hospital group to build a hospital in an impoverished area. So that has both a social return as well as a financial return. So I hope that answered that part of the question. Your other part was ROV, which is return on value. So I wrote about that in the book a little bit. And there's a gentleman named Daniel Yankelovich, and he was the person to coin that term. And Yankelovich recommends that companies look at sort of three practical changes to create this thing called trust equity. Basically work with analysts to develop new performance metrics that quantify your trust equity, overhauling leadership development programs to reflect new skills that are needed to address these issues by your top execs in your firm, and including stakeholders, right? Diverse stakeholders. So employees, investors, the media, suppliers, communities in which you operate, NGOs, regulators, et cetera. And then systemically engaging key employees and stakeholders in dialogue that pushes people outside their comfort zones. So those are the three things that he says to sort of get to this place of trust equity. and I hope I'm answering the question. I think it was ESG, SRI, ROV. Yeah. Was there something I missed?
Well, it was talking about some of the metrics or tools, but you know what? That's not that important, quite frankly, I think for this audience and this discussion. And Richard, thank you so much. Maybe we should turn over to Boris, because I know there's been a bunch of chat questions that have come in. So perhaps, Boris, you want to bring some questions forward from the audience.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Richard. Richard, some of the questions that are coming in are dealing with the audience interest in further identifying elements of sustainability, purpose, and ESG at the company level and the product level. So Gordon Campbell is asking about how to define and identify sustainability at a company level. And then we have a question from Roberto Sartho, who's talking about looking at the product level, and product level being ESG thoughtful or being compliant with some of the purpose and sustainability goals that we talk about. Could you talk a little bit more about those things?
Sure. So I think probably the most difficult part of this ESG, sustainable investing, SRI, et cetera, is the nuance and the lack of standardization. There are now, as we talked about before, the big four accounting firms that are getting together to say, look, we need a framework for standardization across the board and how we measure ESG and what we do. But the nuance is so deep and so detailed. I mean, even with the UN sustainability, the SDGs, right? The Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them. You saw them, numbered and color coded, and there are hundreds of sub goals, right? Just for those 17. I would say that it's up to us in our various organizations to sort of keep the pressure on, in a positive way, and to take all these acronyms that we've talked about and to really use them to our advantage when we're talking about things like the product and some of the things on the company level, Boris, that you mentioned in those questions, right? So, asking if it's about an investment versus about your company itself, where does our company stand on environmental issues? How can we become a leader in this area? You want to think about things like air emissions and air quality. You want to think about natural resources use, land use, energy use, conservation, a transition to a more green energy source, waste management, water quality, hazardous materials use. So some of these things, right? Using the ESG framework to think about these things on a product level or a company level. On the social side of things, right? Where do we as a company stand on this, on issues of the S in ESG, social issues, and how can we become a leader in those issues? What are our equal opportunity opportunities? Equal employment opportunities. I always have a hard time saying that one for some reason. Equal employment opportunities. And are we committed to that? What does our workforce look like now and why? Do we offer healthcare and education? And if you're a big enough company, housing services? What's your local community impact? What are your labor standards like? What are your relationships like with your employees? And then the G, governance, right? If we're using the ESG acronym as a guide, where do we stand on governance issues? What are our ethical business practices? And a lot of times, these ideas seem a little bit ethereal, right? A lot of times companies don't stop and say, what are our ethical business practices? And what I like to say often is, what will we say no to? As a company, what will we say no to? We know what we say yes to, we know what we're out there in the market, what we're trying to achieve, but what will we say no to? What are our boundaries? What are these lines in the sand that we draw? So what are ethical business practices? Do we have board independence, or is it just a group of yes men surrounding a CEO? Do we have diversity on the board? Real diversity of thought and background and life experience. What's our executive pay look like versus our employee pay? Are we actually transparent with our accounting and tax issues? And what are our voting rights look like? So having responses to those questions will help clarify, your business's core beliefs, right? And that prepares you to begin leveraging ESG to your benefit. It can help answer some of those product questions and questions at the company level. So I hope that, I know, long answer to a short question, but I hope that helps.
They were very broad and helpful questions, and I think that's a helpful answer. Thank you. The other one we have, which is a comment and a question, Richard, from Sarah Kobodi. Sarah says, thanks, Richard, for the presentation. How big of a role do you think artificial intelligence would play in promoting ESG? And if that's an area in which companies are investing their ESG budget? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I hope that a lot of companies do actually have an ESG budget. There is usually, what we're probably all more familiar with, which is CSR. And those budgets. And I think that as companies make this transition, I mean, there is a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity to transition to a zero carbon future. And folks, I think, will see that. As far as AI, I'm not an expert in AI by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that as data gets put at the heart of some of these ESG decisions and measurement, that artificial intelligence and machine learning can be used to identify issues. And also those are opportunities as well, because a lot of this stuff, as we've talked about before, are cost savings. And you'll see that sustainable companies, they attract investment, they're better long-term bets. The beta operates in a much more narrow band. So I do think there's an opportunity for AI. I could probably connect the person who asked the question with folks who could better answer that question, but that would be my summation.
Understood, thank you. The next question we have from Alexi is outpacing returns of ESG companies versus other stocks. Is it likely the impact of increased public attention, or is it driven by better financial outlook and other fundamental factors?
Yeah, well, so better financial outlook, I think for sure. I think that the understanding is based on data, especially based on recent data, that sustainable companies do outperform. They do have lower downside risk in the long term. So I think that is fundamentally important. There has been a bit of a rush for ESG investments. There are now 2,704, I think, ESG funds in the United States. And that number has skyrocketed in recent years. So yes, there's money pouring into the space. But I think if you look at the fundamentals, the reason that I mentioned about zero net financed emissions before is really the cost of capital issue. If you don't have banks willing to lend to extraction companies for their projects, again, let's use a specific example, drilling for oil in the Arctic. If banks are facing pressure from investors and they begin to refuse to lend for those sorts of extraction projects, the cost of capital for those extraction projects goes up, and they obviously, profit goes down. And so the opportunities look less and less attractive. And I think that is that's a bright spot for the E in ESG. And I think that is a change that is not going to go anywhere, right? It's only going to increase. There's increased pressure on banks. You see a new bank sort of every week or 2 weeks now finally signing on and saying, oh yeah, we're going to do net zero financed emissions as well. You saw the list before. There's some notable exceptions. Goldman's been criticized recently for investing in sustainable businesses and committing $750 billion to ESG and sustainability, but those are financial plays for the firm, whereas they themselves haven't sort of walked the walk, as Stephen was mentioning before. I was actually on the stage with John Goldstein, who runs sustainability at Goldman last week or the week before. And they talk a lot about what they're doing from an investment standpoint with ESG, but have still not committed to net zero financed emissions. So the pressure's on, and you'll see some of those dominoes fall as well.
Understood. Thank you, Richard. In terms of the actions of some businesses that have had negative impact on the environment or loss of life. A friend said Nedvedek is asking about Boeing's actions in respect to 737 MAX, asking about Volkswagen in respect to auto exhaust emissions and some of the actions of these companies in those instances. How does one account, how does one in some way measure the kind of negative impact of businesses?
Sure. So I might answer the question a little bit a different way. So I mentioned before George Serafim, who is at HBS, and he's been working on this project of impact-weighted accounts. And so basically, his thesis, along with some other folks, and by the way, the BEI, the Business and Environment Initiative, HBS, is something you should all check out as well. There's a woman there named Lynn Schneck who runs that. So BEI, Business and Environment Initiative, really interesting work by some folks at HBS. But anyway, getting back to George. So George Serafim over at HBS as well, he's working on this project, this impact-weighted accounts. And his basic thesis is, for 100 years, we've only focused on one metric, and that is financial return. And so if you're running a company, you're trying to maximize shareholder value, right, as we talked about earlier on in the presentation, you do everything you possibly can to maximize shareholder return. And that includes, negative externalities, right? So back in the day, you could have slavery, child labor, no safety standards whatsoever, incredibly long and arduous, working hours and terrible conditions, right? And of course, then the government steps in and legislates things. Then businesses sort of come along. What George is saying is businesses still benefit from all these negative externalities that they're able to put on the rest of us, right? I mean, exhaust from factories, right? Climate change, all sorts of, pollution-related negative externalities that we as a society suffer from. And so what George is doing is saying, look, we need to take not only financial metrics into consideration, but we need to take in all these other non-financial metrics into consideration as well. Assign a cost or a price to them, and then basically create a new set of books that says, here's how much money we've really made and lost as a company, including a price for all the negative externalities that we've foisted onto the rest of society. So it's a very, very interesting project that he's working on. And when you actually associate a price with these negative externalities, the fundamentals of the profit and loss of the business change dramatically when you just end up including these negative externalities with the costs associated. So I would say have a look at impact-weighted accounts, the impact-weighted accounts project at HBS.
Thank you, Richard. I want to do a quick time check as we're slightly over the hour. Richard and Steve, do you have a couple more questions in you? I think there's 2 more questions right now remaining in the queue. So if we go for another 7 to 10 minutes, would that be okay with each of you?
I'll be as fast as I can, sure.
Steve?
That's fine, Boris.
Sounds good. Thank you both. Richard, the question that we have next is Gyantri Chowdhury is saying, thanks for the presentation. When it comes to sustainable financing, are there standard risk checks prescribed to finance arrangers or banks in respect to ESG, in respect to sustainability?
Well, yes. So maybe, but potentially the asker of the question can just ping me directly, because there's a site that I would direct her to that is that talks about various impact investing opportunities and sort of slices and dices, organizes by category. And then there's a rating system that says sort of which are the best in these categories. So it's very detailed. So you could, for example, say, hey, I want to invest in Latinx female entrepreneurs in underserved communities in a certain country. And then this framework identifies the best ways in which to do that. And so I would direct the person with the question to that site. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I've got it in my research. So there's that. And then as far as, I think the other question was around credit and financing. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. And how can there be risk checks? And I understand this question from the way I'm reading it to refer to the credit risk effectively and assessing risk of the entity potentially not being ESG compliant, not being sustainable, and being of risk on those factors, and maybe even on what earlier on Francis was talking about, the negative actions hurting the environment, causing death, etc., and the negative possible impact of the actions of a company.
Yeah, so I'll try and be quick on this one as well. So I mentioned a couple of firms that I've been advising and talking to about impact measurement. And it's really, really interesting because some of the larger companies are leveraging the technologies that I've been talking about and the firms that I've been advising. And what happened, they've been leveraging those with their suppliers. So I think I can say this. I'll give you an example. IKEA has their a mandate that they do things the I way, the IKEA way, and fair business practices, things like that. And so they're using an impact measurement software. This is the one that I mentioned before, with some of their suppliers to make sure that their suppliers are ESG compliant. Well, what does that do? That helps IKEA know that they can feel good about purchasing from this supplier. It helps the supplier, if they're able to report all these metrics in real time, lower their cost of capital, so they can then have access to more capital at a cheaper rate, be able to expand production and sell more to IKEA. In this case, IKEA knows in real time, all the time, that their supplier is ESG compliant. So this is sort of this virtuous cycle that happens from measurement, especially real-time data-driven measurement. So there are solutions to address those concerns, and I hope that answer helps.
Thank you. And then the next question is, and this is from Faye, who is asking, what are some main impacts on global cooperation from elevated economics, especially between USA and China?
Well, okay. So it's always a dance, I think, with the U.S. and China. There was a report that just the other day that China has 14 more new coal-fired power plants coming online. Yet they say that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2060, as you saw earlier in the presentation. Typically what happens is folks in the developing world will look at the United States, who's sitting here, wagging our finger, and Canada and Europe, right, saying, oh, you need to be, embracing this transition to a net zero energy economy, et cetera. And they then in turn come back to the developed nations, the United States, Europe, Canada, et cetera, and say, look, you've had 100 years of the benefit of polluting society in order to get to the place where you are today. Don't come and lecture us about these issues. So it's very difficult. It's very nuanced. I think that I still remain somewhat optimistic, maybe as is my nature, but I think that with the right pressure, sort of this soft diplomacy and pressure from consumers and from companies about their supply chains and about regulation, that hopefully that China will get there. But it's probably a question better suited for somebody much smarter and more experienced in those areas than I am. But I do remain optimistic. I'll leave it there.
Richard, thank you. Thank you very much for joining the HBS Club of Toronto and Steve and I for this discussion. It's been insightful. Thank you very much, and thanks to all, and wishing everyone a great rest of the day.
Boris and Richard, thank you both.
You guys, this was great. Really enjoyed it. Thank you to the panelists, Stephen, Boris, thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here and your thoughtfulness going into this presentation. And everybody who joined, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. I appreciate your time so much. Feel free to reach out. Happy to engage.